A young Cherokee woman flees a forced marriage meant to secure political power, not love, not freedom. Her pursuer, Gray Elk, commands an army and sees her as a symbol to control, not a soul to protect. But when a quiet prospector named Thomas Burrow steps between her and a war, the story takes a turn no one expected. Just wait until you hear how 350 drawn arrows never flew, and why, in the end, justice spoke louder than fear. The storm came down like a curtain pulled across the mountains, thick, blinding, merciless, the kind of rain that could bury a man's tracks or his regrets. Thomas Burrow had seen storms before. He'd lived through winters that cracked bones and summers that baked the truth out of men. But that night, as he trudged through the mud toward his cabin with a sack of coal and an aching spine, he saw something that made him stop mid-step. A woman. She stood barely 3 paces from his door, her dress clinging to her frame like bark to a dying tree. Rainwater streamed from her hair, and in her hands she held a bundle, wrapped in aged leather, gripped tightly like it was the last thing she owned that still had meaning. Her feet were bare, her shoulders shook from cold or fear, maybe both, but her eyes didn't flinch. They met his without blinking, not pleading, not demanding, just there, like the storm itself. "Please," she said, barely more than breath, "if I go back, I won't come back again." Thomas didn't speak. He hadn't spoken much at all since the spring thaw. Solitude had become his skin, and words felt like tools he no longer knew how to use. But something about her, maybe the way she stood her ground in the rain, maybe the blood trailing down her sleeve, stirred a memory. One he thought he'd buried out in the coal fields, or maybe at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. He stepped aside. The door creaked open, and for the first time in a long time, the fire inside had a reason to burn for someone other than him. She didn't say much that first hour. She sat on a worn stool by the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket that still smelled faintly of pine. Thomas moved slowly, pouring hot water into a tin mug, slicing bread with the same care he used to pan for gold, cautious, deliberate, quiet. When she finally unwrapped her shawl, he saw it. A clean wound, high on her left shoulder. A rifle, likely. The blood had clotted, but the skin was angry and bruised. Beneath the torn fabric, there was beadwork, intricate, soaked and darkened by the storm. Not store-bought, hand-stitched, Cherokee craftsmanship. She caught him looking. "Ayanna," she said softly, "that's my name." Thomas gave a slight nod, but didn't ask for more. Names were weighty things out here. They carried history, often the kind best left unspoken. Downhill, 10 miles through mud and pine, the town of Stillwater lay quiet, a mining town born of profit and shaped by suspicion. It had 1 church, 3 saloons, and a jail that never stayed empty long. Its people feared what they didn't understand, and they understood even less when it came to the Cherokee, especially women like Ayanna, too proud to bow, too quiet to confess, and too brave to run without reason. But up here, in a cabin built by silence and warmed by reluctant kindness, no one asked what she was running from. Not yet, because the rain hadn't stopped, and the real storm hadn't even begun. The rain slowed just before dawn, leaving the air thick with silence and the scent of wet pine. The fire in the hearth had gone to embers, casting long shadows that stretched like ghosts across the floor. Ayanna sat upright in the chair by the window, wrapped in Thomas's old quilt. Her eyes were open, but distant, like she wasn't in the room at all. It wasn't until the wind shifted and the floor creaked beneath her that she finally spoke. Her voice was low, cracked by cold and burden. "I was promised," she began, each word pulled like thread from a wound. "To Gray Elk, son of a war chief, they said it would keep peace between the old ways and the new treaties." She didn't say the man's name with anger. She said it with finality, like a stone dropped into water, something that had already sunk too deep to pull back. "He's feared," she continued, "respected and cruel. But they needed him. The elders, the council. He holds men in his hand like matches. If he burns, the whole forest follows." Thomas sat at the edge of the room, sharpening a dull blade with methodical care. His eyes never left the steel, but his ears missed nothing. When she paused, he didn't speak. He simply listened, as if the silence itself was sacred. "I didn't just run from him," she whispered. "I ran from what they made me part of. I was never asked what I wanted." For a long moment, the only sound was the whetstone scraping across metal. Thomas finally looked up. "I've seen men like him," he said, voice low. "They don't chase what they've lost. They come to take it back." It wasn't a warning. It was a memory. That night, after Ayanna had drifted into a restless sleep, Thomas stood at the doorway with his coat over his shoulders and his rifle slung low. He watched the sky. No stars, just clouds thick as secrets. He saddled his horse without a word. Stillwater was quiet by night. Oil lamps flickered in a few windows, but most had long since gone dark. The town slept uneasy, as if it knew the past was about to come knocking. Sheriff Elwood Crane stood outside the jailhouse, his coat heavy with rain and a rifle resting in his arms. A Bible tucked under his elbow like a ledger. He was a man who believed law should be held, not followed, a ledger keeper of men, not mercy. He didn't look surprised to see Thomas. "Burrow," he said, "I got word from the ridge. Scout riders, Cherokee, moving through the high pass. Not the kind that come for trade." He paused, tilted his head like a man listening to a clock wind down. "You wouldn't be giving shelter to someone important, would you?" Thomas met his eyes, said nothing. Silence stretched thin between them. But silence from a man like Thomas wasn't quiet. It was a line drawn in dirt. Crane tapped his rifle. "Well, just thought you'd want to know what's stirring." Thomas turned without a word and mounted his horse, but the conversation didn't leave him. It rode beside him, like a second shadow, all the way back to the cabin. By the time he saw his lantern-lit window on the hill, something inside him had shifted. Not fear, not anger. Resolve. The kind a man carries when he realizes the past is coming. And this time, it has a name, a horse, and a trail marked in blood. And though the fire inside the cabin still burned soft and warm, Thomas knew the storm wasn't over. It had just changed shape. The first light of morning crept across the valley like a slow breath. But something was wrong. Thomas Burrow awoke before the sun cleared the ridge. Not from sound, but from its absence. No wind, no birds, no rustle of pine. Only stillness. A silence so heavy it pressed against the walls of the cabin like a warning. He stepped outside, rifle across his back, boots sinking into the wet earth. What he saw stopped him cold. Across the hills that bordered Stillwater, like shadows woven into the fog, stood a line of warriors. Not a few, hundreds. More than 300 Cherokee horsemen and scouts, each one motionless, their bows drawn, arrows lifted as one. But they weren't aimed at the mountains. They were aimed at the town. Ayanna moved to his side, her breath sharp in the cold. Her face had changed, the fear replaced now by something harder. Resignation, memory, resolve. Among the riders, one dismounted, Gray Elk. He stood tall even in stillness, his voice cutting through the air like lightning over the plains. "Return my bride, or the town falls." No rage, no negotiation, just the edge of something absolute. Behind Thomas, doors creaked open. Townsfolk trickled out, gathering with suspicion in their eyes and rifles shaking in their hands. The old wounds of fear and difference surfaced fast, and deeper than most even knew they carried. Sheriff Crane emerged, shotgun across his chest, boots crunching gravel. He looked at Thomas, waiting for an answer that would define everything. But Thomas didn't flinch. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate, until he stood between the town and the warriors, between fear and fire, and then, with a voice louder than the valley, he called out, "She's not property!" He turned slightly toward the crowd behind him, then back to the line ahead. "Not yours, not mine, not this country's. You want blood? You'll have to start with mine." Silence fell again, this time heavier. Even the wind held its breath. Crane stiffened, confused, unsure whether to aim his weapon forward or back. The crowd murmured behind Thomas, torn between instinct and disbelief. No one moved, not even the horses. Then Gray Elk stepped down from the rise and walked alone toward the front. The warriors did not lower their arrows, neither did Thomas. They stood 10 paces apart. 2 men, once strangers, now the last voice each side might listen to. Gray Elk's gaze never left Ayanna, but before he could speak, her voice rang out, calm, clear. "I gave you my heart once," she said. The wind stirred. "But you ruled it like land you had to conquer." The words struck harder than any blade. They weren't angry. They were honest. And that, for Gray Elk, was the deeper cut. Not her escape, not her defiance, but the truth. She had not belonged to him, and never would. And in that single moment, what once seemed like betrayal revealed itself as something simpler, sadder, freedom. All eyes turned to Gray Elk, and the decision he would make next would not just decide a woman's fate, but whether Stillwater burned or finally breathed. For a moment, no one moved. Gray Elk stood in the hush between tension and surrender, his eyes fixed on Ayanna. But not with rage nor pride. Something deeper stirred behind his gaze, understanding. Perhaps too late, but true nonetheless. "You ran," he said at last, his voice quieter now, almost unsure. "But you didn't run from me. You ran from the war I carry." The words didn't echo. They landed gently, like rain on dry ground. He looked past her, to Thomas, the weathered prospector who had stepped between two storms. "You gave her shelter," Gray Elk said, "a kindness few would have dared." Thomas said nothing. He simply met the man's stare, unshaken. And then, without ceremony, Gray Elk reached into a pouch on his side and pulled out a small leather bundle. He walked forward alone, unarmed, and placed it in Thomas's hand. Inside, a carved eagle feather, polished smooth with age, bound with beadwork, and etched with a single mark. A Cherokee symbol of peace and of protection. Gray Elk raised his voice once more, this time to the town, to the hills, and to history itself. "Stillwater doesn't need to burn," he said, "but the fire in our hearts must change what we protect." One by one, the warriors lowered their bows. No signal, no command, just the weight of one decision making its way across 300 hearts. The townsfolk, silent and stunned, watched as the wall of threat melted into the woods like mist in morning sun. No shots, no smoke, no blood, just peace, born not of agreement, but of recognition. By noon, the Cherokee were gone. The trails were quiet again. That evening, as the last light touched the hills, Ayanna stood outside the cabin one final time. She wore no shawl, no borrowed coat, just the wind in her hair and the wild in her eyes. Thomas leaned in the doorway. She looked back once with a soft smile. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she vanished, not with urgency, but with grace, not fleeing, but walking forward, finally, freely, toward her own story. In the years that followed, Stillwater never spoke much of that morning, not out of shame, but reverence, a tale too strange to be just legend, too honest to be forgotten. They spoke of the woman with the fire in her eyes, of a prospector who chose peace over fear, of 350 arrows that never flew, and somewhere beneath the mountain the fire still burned, but now it protected.